Hey, everyone. Well, this is a much fuller room than I was expecting at 5 o'clock. I applaud you. Thank you for coming and making sure it was more than just like Brian Olendike and John Picozzi sitting in here. You all deserve this applause. Thank you. I hope you're all having an amazingly awesome first day of DrupalCon, or second or third, depending on which other events you've been to. My name is jpamental, and I'm going to talk to you about fonts. More specifically about using fonts appropriately and performantly in the age of responsive design and lots of options that designers keep whining for, like me. So, who am I? I am the co-founder of H&W Design, a small design firm in Providence, Rhode Island that does web strategy and design consulting, and when we build stuff, we build it in Drupal. And we've been doing that for quite some time. Also the co-founder of Drupal PVD, the local meetup in Providence that's been going on for a few years now, because there's actually a pretty fair-sized Drupal community there, which is really pretty awesome. I'm also the co-host of Talking Drupal. It's a weekly video hangout show that I do along with my friend John Picozzi over there, and two other fine folks, Steve Cross and Nick Laughlin. We do that every week, and it's an outgrowth of all of the other things that we do about Drupal and what we learn. And the important thing about all of these, I'm also the co-parent of my pal Tristan, and if anybody follows me on Instagram, they know that all I ever do is walk my dog around the reservoir and go to Drupal conferences. I'm just bearing that out. But the co is really important in all of these things, because another word that starts with that same syllable is community. And all of these things are tied to that. And it's the community of Drupal that has really been a special thing for me, and actually is the start of my interest in web fonts and performance. I've always loved type, but I didn't really start thinking about the implications of implementing that type until a few years ago. So how did I get here to this stage at this DrupalCon at this point in my life? Well, it started at DrupalCon Chicago. And as all these good stories often do, it was in a bar at about 2 a.m. Somehow Morton was involved. Shocker. And I will tell you, it also started at 6 in the evening at Rock Bottom, literally. A place called Rock Bottom, the restaurant. And many hours later, I was in this bar with a couple of really great guys, Matt Tucker and Al Steffen, amongst a few others. And one of their chief complaints about web fonts was how much it impacted the performance of their websites and the experience of getting that content on screen. And so after a number of beers and a lot of discussions about the typography on various people's T-shirts, I got them to understand that type actually really matters as part of design and experience. And that led me down a path of doing a lot more investigation, a lot more writing, and a lot more speaking. And thankfully, for me, a deal with O'Reilly to write more about it. So I'll tell you more about that later. But what I wanted to talk to you about today is what I mean by responsive typography, because it is kind of a dangerous thing to sort of co-opt that term, responsive, and talk about something that's not really just about responsive design. So I'm going to talk a little bit about responsive design, and this is where we get into the lies and deceptions. And good responsive design starts us covering things about an honest reconciliation and getting back to what responsive design helps us uncover about the design process and the reality of people experiencing our design. And then I'm going to talk about how responsive typography is part of that and also part of something else in terms of how we set up our sites, the reasons why typography is so important, and how that impacts small and large screens alike. Then we're going to have a few tips about how to make your typography responsive, and we're going to also talk about how to prototype these things, because much like real shipping software trumps any document about that software, real stuff wins. Real type wins, not a picture of type, not a Photoshop document, because that's not how type renders. Real type in a browser. So it's really important that you make that part of your design process. So let's move on. We're going to talk about this quote that came across my Twitter feed. Now, how many people in the room are designers by background? Okay, that's awesome. What's really awesome is not more than a little over half the people in the room raise their hand, which really makes me happy because this talk is as much for developers and site owners and brand owners as it is for designers. It's very important. So Stephen Blakeborough is a very talented fellow, and he was complaining about the fact that we call it web typography. Why can't we just say typography? Well, we can't. It's part of that, and it's a whole lot more. So it's all of what you know about type. And for those of you who have a traditional design background, you have a tremendous advantage these days because you have a much deeper understanding of what type can do to further your design and convey emotion and message than people that found their way into web design and don't have the benefit of that background in really a deep understanding of typography. So it does all the things that you know about type, but it also has to do a whole lot more because there's this additional consideration of the performance of getting it on screen, how many typefaces can you load, what happens during that loading process, how many devices is it going to render well on or not. I mean, there's a lot of extra things that we have to think about. This is the Grace Kelly analogy. She did everything that Fred Astaire did backwards and in heels. Well, web typography is like that. Now, the other thing that complicates our life is that we can't do this in a fixed canvas. So a lot of the things that we learned about typography were really based on a fixed canvas, a piece of paper, or ink on paper more specifically, and the way that those things worked, the way that typefaces were developed, the way that we set type, the relationships between large blocks of copy and small, all of those things were based around fixed knowns of paper size. And all of that has gone out the window in the age of responsive design. And one of the other things that we have to think about is beyond the website. When you think about headless Drupal and DrupalCons rolling down the street, we have to think about where does our content go? Well, Amazon has been selling more ebooks than print for 3 years. Our reading experience is taking place on screens more and more. And there's typography there. The ebook format itself is based around HTML5, CSS3, and JavaScript. So everything that we know about design and typography that we put into a website could also be going into a great ebook design, because how many really trashy-looking ebooks have we seen? There are a lot of other problems that come into play. So we have to start a much more honest assessment of what we know, what we can know, what we can do, and what we can't. It's not the stuff that we don't know, it's the stuff that we ignore that is really going to kill us. So how does this fit with responsive design? Let's talk about some of the things about our world in web design that we've been telling ourselves and our clients for so many years. Well, how about 960 pixels? That's a lie. That was never a good normal. That just happened to be something that we could conveniently hang our hat around and say, enough people have a screen this size, so we'll plan for that, we'll design for it, and that's where we'll stand. That's our line in the sand. Well, it gets worse, because then we came up with this, pixel perfect. Probably the single worst phrase ever perpetrated upon the world by the industry that we are in. It's our own fault. We came up with this and said, of course we can make a web page that looks like that. So we've been slaves to that for almost 20 years. It doesn't have to be. It probably never will be exactly the same. And it certainly can't be the same on your iPhone as it is on a 27-inch desktop. Why are we going to even try? We want to actually deliver the content in an appropriate design and an appropriate experience for the context in which that design is being experienced. So pixel perfect has also got to go. We also have this little conundrum that I got from a talk that Jeff Eaton gave, and I thought this was really pretty fantastic, because when I mentioned that about ebooks, I mean, think about a content management system. What's a page? It's not a page. It's what fits on the screen at any given time, but it's a chunk of content. Now, that chunk of content might be what it could fit on a sticky note, or it might be something that's a 50-foot scroll. We have no idea, because we're also working in a content management system We hope Drupal. But we don't know what that content's going to be tomorrow. So how are we supposed to design that perfect page when we don't know what that page contains, we don't know how big the piece of paper is, and we don't know what kind of ink is being used to put it on the screen in the first place? Is it going to be on an old XP machine? Because dirty little secret, Microsoft doesn't want you to know XP is still about 40% of their installed base globally. And that is the worst type rendering engine you could possibly imagine. So all of the great type that we have looks just horrible in that environment. And then we have the other booming market of feature phones all running Opera Mini that won't run at font face at all, probably ever. So we've got this sort of schism growing that we can't even define what a page is, let alone the screen that it's going to be on. So we have to start casting these things out. So let's start throwing some things out the window. Let's throw out screen size, because we can't know. Let's throw out device capabilities, because we can't really know that either. We also can't know what they're doing at the time. What is their depth of focus on experiencing our design? And what was the purpose of their visit in the first place? So to put that into context, it could be a phone, but that phone may be in use at the line, in the line at the bank, or it could be sitting on the couch, or it could be sitting on the train or on a plane. So you don't know what is the depth of focus that I have in interacting with your content. You can't know that. So making any assumptions about what you should put in that mobile website or how much content you should include is a very dangerous game for you to play with your client's content, or your own if it's your own website. But that's a game that we can't afford to play, and our clients certainly aren't going to buy it. So when we take away all these things that we can't know, what's left on the screen? You see this BBC News site, there's not much left there when you take away the type. It's only once you add it back that you start to understand what this site is all about. So the type is a really pretty important aspect of this. So we get it. Type is important. Responsive design places an even bigger weight on type. It has an even bigger burden to carry, because as the screen size gets smaller, all you see is type. It's one of the only design elements that you have left on the screen. So how are you carrying that brand voice forward? How are you conveying the tone and the emotion that you're trying to bring through this site to the experience for that user when type is the only thing on the screen? You can't rely on any of the other graphics or the other embellishments that you've put on the screen in order to convey that voice and that tone. It's got to be done through the type. And frankly, I don't think that BBC is really doing that job very well here. But I think the New Yorker is doing a fantastic job. When you look at that on iOS, it has Irwin and it has Neutra, the same typefaces that you see in print. The same typeface that has been essentially unchanged for decades, identifying the brand voice of that magazine. They've done a fantastic job of bringing it down here on this screen where it's small enough you can't see a logo, but you look at that, and if you're familiar with that magazine, you are instantly familiar with the experience that you're having on this. And I think that's pretty fantastic, that you can do that with just a few characters on the screen. So in responsive design, type plays a very, very big role. So we get it, right? So responsive typography, we're going to talk about 4 main elements that are part of what makes responsive type. Actually, let me restate. Responsive typography. Because the type itself is not responsive. There are people that are talking about things to do with that, but that's not really the focus here. So, performance. Biggest complaint that I had in that conversation in that bar a few years back was about performance. So the problem is the default is add everything. Well, that's a huge load to put on your user, and it's a lot of stuff to download, and that's going to have an incredibly negative impact on their experience. So we need to choose fonts with care, load only the weights and variants that we're actually using, and we need to do it in such a way that it does not block the content getting to the screen. And that's a very important point that I'm going to come back to, because I think the browser vendors are really letting us down here. Progressive enhancement. Our typography needs to embrace this at its very core, because if your design isn't on the screen, then that is not a successful design. That's the first criteria, performance. So we need to have a solid baseline experience that doesn't block the drawing of the page and will work no matter what happens. Then we need to address things like FOUT, or flash of unstyled text, or flash of unseen text in the case of the way WebKit and a lot of the other browser vendors have gone now, introducing a delay of drawing anything on the screen. Proportion is the third element. As screen sizes shrink and less is on the screen to distract you, the proportion between headings and body copy become absolutely critical, but they can also be far more subtle. And I'm going to show you some examples of what happens when you don't actually do anything with that during the course of implementing your design. And it can have some really negative results, both from an aesthetic standpoint, but also from a usability one. So it's really very important to take some care with that. And then there's polish. Because really, when type is the only thing carrying that brand voice on that small screen, you need to sweat the details. You need to pay attention to every little thing because there's very little else on that screen at any given time. So that's our 4 Ps that we're going to talk about today. So let's talk about performance. Well, any designer is going to understand that great type isn't throwing everything on the page. Great type is about making smart choices and making consistent ones that help guide people through the use of this website and this design. You need to load only what you need. So, trade Gothic next. There's the typeface. And I'm generalizing a little bit, but generally speaking, trade Gothic is a family. What we're talking about specifically on the page is a font, a specific weight and variant, which translates to a specific computer file that is loaded with that font information. That means it's a download. And because of the vagaries of the web, it's actually potentially 4 downloads because we actually need 4 different formats in order to serve web fonts to the broadest spectrum of users. So when you think about body copy, you've got regular, italic, bold, and bold italic times 4. It's potentially 16 files that might need to be downloaded if you don't structure your code correctly. So there's a lot of things to consider there in using a web font. But I'll tell you, I do use web fonts for body copy on every single site because that is the single biggest differentiator visually when you come to a website full of text. Take it out of Arial, put it into something that looks just that little bit nicer, a little bit more refined, and you have a completely different experience. It's worth it as long as you do it with care. But every one of these things has a performance cost, so you have to have a budget, and you have to spend that budget wisely. This is what would happen typically with Typekit when it first launched. If you added a font to your project, it would actually, by default, enable every single weight and variant. Now, they don't do that anymore, but I've enabled them all here so you can see what the difference is. And inside that highlighted circle, it's about 440K that's being downloaded potentially on every single page when somebody's looking at your website. But that's not likely what you'd be using. So I set this project up as a sort of fictional example with a slab serif for headers. We probably only need 1 weight of that. And we only need 4 weights of the sans serif typeface. So when I do it correctly, it's now down to about 120K. That's far more reasonable. And with advances in the way they do their font hosting, most of that is cached, so it's not being loaded on every page. So there's tremendous performance benefits that have come from being smarter about what you enable, and the font service is actually getting better at how they package that and serve it. So that takes care of part of the problem. We reduce the initial load, but there's still that moment of nothing on the screen. And I contend that this is our own fault because we've been largely ignoring an easy solution that's been around for almost 5 years. Less than a year after Typekit launched, they worked in conjunction with Google and created something called the Google Web Font Loader. That service has been available for us to use to load web fonts since 2010. And it provides an almost seamless way to get the content on screen without any delay, lets you tune up your CSS so that there's less transition between that fallback web-safe font and the web font that you want it to look like. So this is what happens on load. Either you get a fallback font or you see nothing with some random underlines, and then you see the content that you really want. And we all see this all the time, and we've become so used to it, we start to tune it out. But there's a lot of research that says if you don't get something on screen for your mobile users within 5 seconds, you will lose 75% of your visitors. And all the browser vendors have now introduced up to a 3-second delay before they draw anything on the screen if the web font hasn't loaded yet. That's a pretty dangerous game of roulette. You've just wasted 60% of the time before you lose 70% of your audience by not putting this simple little trick in place. So use the web font loader, and if you Google that, there's lots of examples. I actually have some articles that have been published in various places on the fonts.com blog. It's a very easy trick. Using the web font loader, it's going to inject these classes into the HTML tag of your page, and it will give you the hook to get around this problem. So if you use this one string will embed Trade Gothic, and then the fallback is Helvetica and Arial. That's going to leave a blank screen during the loading process. But if we add in this line after, WF inactive, the web fonts have not loaded yet, use Helvetica, and it will draw that right away. As soon as that class is present, it's nearly instantaneous. It loads the fallback font. Now, what you've introduced is a concrete, absolute certainty that they are going to see unstyled text. Fine. The key there is that it doesn't have to be unstyled. That's the simple answer. Because if you have that line, WF inactive body, now you can use font size, line height, and letter spacing to even out the way the fallback font looks in comparison to how the live web font looks. So you can avoid all that jumpiness and reflow. It's actually quite a simple little trick. And that really has been around for nearly 5 years. There's no excuse. I talk to people about this all the time, and some of the most known people you could possibly imagine in the world of responsive design, this was news to them less than 6 months ago. That's very unfortunate, because it's an easy trick. But thankfully they know now, so maybe we'll get past that. Next thing is progressive enhancement, because this actually goes hand in hand. How you choose to structure your CSS goes directly to how it will work when the web fonts don't load. So this is a little example here. This is with the web fonts loaded. Now using the same little technique, I'm going to show you what happens. We have no web fonts with no correction. So this is the web font and the fallback fonts with absolutely no correction applied. This is adding that correction in our CSS. So I've adjusted the fallback CSS just a little bit to avoid some of the same line breaks and jumpiness. And now the web font loads. It's a barely perceptible change. Now, with every pair of typefaces, that's going to be a little bit different. So there's always going to be something. But the idea here is not to eliminate the change, but minimize the perception of change. That's the key in a better experience. By minimizing the perception of change, avoiding reflow and menus wrapping down into the second row and that sort of thing, people don't notice it quite so much. We hardly notice when a JPEG loads and it's rough at first and then it fills in. We expect that. It's normal behavior. It gets something on the screen quickly to preserve the space, and then it gradually sharpens. That's exactly what we're doing with the typography. And as long as we keep things from jumping around, we've really saved them from that whole jumpiness and bad experience. So talking about proportion, this is the next P. Now, proportion was something that really struck me about a year and a half ago when I started getting into doing a lot more responsive design and starting to look at things on a lot of different devices and teaching it a little bit. And it started to realize that all of my experience as a print designer led me to look at type relationships in one particular way. But as the screen sizes changed, I really had to reevaluate. So we needed to start looking at it differently. And the problem with a lot of the responsive design solutions that are out there is they're concerned more about fitting more stuff on the screen than they are about fitting things at an appropriate size to preserve the meaning and intent of our design. That's a very important concept there. We're talking about meaning and hierarchy. That's why we use an H1 and an H2. We have semantic meaning in our code. We have to preserve it visually. But we have to preserve it visually in a manner that's appropriate for the device upon which it's being viewed. So when we think about Robert Bringhurst and the elements of typographic style and how big should our headings be to our body copy, all of those things are based around a larger canvas and lots of other distractions. But when it gets small, it has to look different. So we have to think about those kinds of scales and the kinds of traditions that have been around in conveying meaning and information, because that's what we're all used to seeing, but we have to think about it in a slightly different way. So we have this shot here, and you're seeing next to it that same scale applied on a phone, and you can see it looks kind of terrible. So that's using the exact same size, probably 3M, compared to the 1M of the body copy for both the site name and the H1. I would contend that this does a much better job of conveying that in a way that gets more content on the screen. It's incredibly readable, and it's still very, very clear what the most important pieces of information on the screen are. So that subtlety in proportion is this kind of sliding scale of heading sizes to body copy. But one thing I do want to stop and mention is what you'll see in all of these is I'm not changing the relative size of the body copy. I'm leaving it at 100% or 1M. And I'm not going to change that on any of these screen sizes because the device makers and operating system vendors have put a huge amount of time and effort into figuring out what is a readable size of type on that device. And by leaving that alone, we allow them to apply their smarts, and we just base everything else proportionally on that. And we allow the device to work the way it should work best, rather than trying to impose our own thoughts on what one relative unit of type should be. And I found that to be a far more successful way of working that introduces fewer issues of compatibility and sort of flow in the design. I wish I could see the screen better. Okay, so this is that scale in table form. And don't worry about trying to take a picture of this because the slides are already up on my site, so you can download it, and it's a lot easier to read when you look at it in a PDF. If you happen to subscribe to .NET Magazine, it was in an article, no, I take it back, Typecast blog. So if you look at, if nobody's ever used Typecast before, it's a fantastic service. I'm going to show you something from it later, but they have a great blog, and even though it's a great blog, they still posted something from me on there, and it's all about this, and that's the link to it down there. So that's all about the proportion of line height and type size as the screen size changes. So here's some examples on a few different size screens of having that applied. And the sample code actually has some buttons in it so you can turn these things on and off and see exactly how things stack up. So it's that same scale going across onto a tablet and onto a phone, and everything looks proportional to the screen size that you're on without really compromising the readability of the experience in the first place. Excuse me. Now, one thing I also want to add here is I've been talking about M's as that one unit of type. And that's the most common way of thinking about type in responsive design because it's relative to itself. And if you have all of the padding above and below in that same relative measure, then everything scales proportionally as the type size changes. What I also want to mention is that if you use M's in your media queries rather than pixels, you will be future-proofing yourself against devices that actually start to report their true resolution. So we have these very high desktop resolutions that are coming, especially in some of these Samsung touchscreen laptops. Well, instead of reporting what we sort of nominally say is a desktop resolution of 1280 by 1024, it happens to have a physical resolution twice that. And all the websites were rendering teeny tiny in the middle of the screen because they were all based on pixels. But any site that used M's in their media queries, it rendered exactly as you would think it should, because everything is based on what that device maker says is one unit of readable type on that screen. So it's very important to think about both the devices on which it's appearing as well as how you're designing. And I know you'll notice that I'm kind of drifting back and forth between design stuff and techie stuff. Well, it's because I don't think you can really separate it. I'm a firm believer in things like real designers code. But I also think real coders need to understand design. I mean, it's not something that can be done in isolation. So here's a few other things about measure and scale that I wanted to bring up. Maximum widths on paragraph tags. It's one thing to let your design scale and have a smaller number of breakpoints. It's a terrible experience to start to let line length get so long that it becomes hard for people to read. So what I've found is, and I think it's not really such a bad solution, is by setting a maximum width on that paragraph, you can actually get something that's roughly equivalent to what Bringhurst recommends for an optimal line length, between 60 and 75 characters or so. And then let the design flow. You'll have a little bit more margin to the right of the text, or you could center that in the content area, and that would work just fine too. But it can preserve the integrity and intent of your design and the readability of the text without requiring that you compromise the rest of the design around it. So a little trick like this at different breakpoints can be really helpful. I wanted to point out that there are other CSS3 measurement units that are coming into play. There's a few that I want to mention. CH and CX CH is basically a character count. So in the font that's loaded, you could set a maximum character count for that line. It's very unevenly supported right now, so I wouldn't recommend it. CX is something that's supposed to be based on the X height of the first font that's loaded. That's also kind of dangerous, because if you're using CX to define a width in your content, but it's actually loaded the fallback font, not the live one, you're setting measurements on the wrong unit, and there's actually nothing you can do about that. So they're unevenly supported, they're interesting, know about them, follow them. Well, that's cool. And be aware that there are things like optimized legibility or font size adjust. There are a number of different flags and attributes that you can modify in CSS3. Very few of them actually do anything in all the different browsers. So some of them can actually be a little harmful to the rendering of the text. So experiment with those things with care. I'm focusing on the things that are most applicable in most scenarios. Again, M's or relative M's, that's another unit that people have been using frequently. That's another one that suffers from compatibility in older versions of IE. If you don't have to worry about IE8, then you could use relative M's to your heart's content. It's a way to use a relative unit that always references back to whatever you set in the HTML element or at the very root of your document, rather than something that looks at the immediate parent. My simple solution to get the broadest compatibility is don't set font sizes on blocks, set them on font elements, and then you never have to do these gymnastics. So you get in trouble with M's by setting font sizes on a div and then putting several different elements in that div and trying to figure out what the font sizes really are specifically. Gets you in a little bit of trouble. But if you don't apply it to the box, but instead apply the font size changes to the text elements themselves, you never actually have that problem. And lastly here, with measure and scale, don't ever try and do a design with lorem ipsum, because lorem is a poser. That is not real text. It doesn't flow like real text. It doesn't fill a content area in a random and unknowable way that gives you this natural feeling of language. So instead, go to a site like Philarati and copy a few paragraphs of Moby Dick. That's what I did for all of my sample stuff. But if you can't get real content from your client, at least get real content from a book or something that you can put in your design that will actually give you a more natural feel with varying word lengths and gaps and paragraph lengths that will give you a more natural feel. Polish. I'm going to come to polish, and I'm going to come to questions. Polish is something that I think I probably had the hardest time thinking about this as part of responsive design or responsive typography until I started looking at a lot more stuff on really small screens and working with a lot of publishers. And those two things really kind of brought it home to me that responsive typography is about more than screen size. It's about experience in reading and taking in content in any way that you come in contact with it. So here we're looking at Salome in the headers and Fira Sans in the body copy. And they're really nice typefaces, but there's more that you can do with them. And by leveraging open type features that allow us to bring more of our typographical knowledge into play, better kerning, ligatures, real fractions, things that we can get in here without having to automatically go and search and replace characters and encode them with Unicode characters and that stuff. By getting a web font that actually has OpenType features enabled with a line or two of CSS, it can go from this to this. So we've got better letter spacing, we've got beautiful ligatures connecting the letters, and just a generally more polished look. So that looks like an editorial headline. That looks like something that can be in a magazine or a book. And we can do that with common, readily supported CSS that you can see in every shipping browser. I can even see it look like this on my Firefox phone. You can't even buy those in this country. But it's got a great browser in it. So there's a lot of detail and polish that can get into your design, and when you're looking at it on a tiny little screen, that's the only thing that is carrying the weight of your design. So those tiny little details get really magnified when you look at them like that. There's some other things that we can do. So here's some other demonstrations of some of the OpenType features. So we've got this font, it's called Fairbank, and this was a site that we did for Monotype early last year to demonstrate these OpenType features. And we had the chance to play around with a bunch of these typefaces and look at these features and how they look when they're on and they're off. And so by toggling this feature on, look at those beautiful swashes and sort of contextual characters that came in. It's not a huge difference for a lot of people, but the overall feel is very, very different. So that went from kind of interesting to Lord of the Rings credits. That's how I always saw the difference with that one. Now here's another one, fractions. So food sites, those are pretty common. A lot of people have to deal with fractions in recipes, and we've always had to do things that looked pretty ugly. A 1 space 1/2. It's 1.5, but it really doesn't look that way. And unless you start doing a lot of character replacement and a lot of searching and replacing, you're never going to get natural fractions unless you have an OpenType font, where magically it will turn it into this. Or this. There we go. So that's what the CSS applied. Somebody still went into the content management system and typed 1 space 1/2. But because it's an OpenType enabled font, that's what gets rendered. And that's a much nicer result. So that's a lot of nice little polish and fit and finish that we can apply. Now here's another one. So layout, and again, layout of content. We can do some really interesting things. We can get a nice initial cap. We can have a paragraph that splits into 2 when you get onto a larger screen. And when it gets down onto a smaller one, it collapses into a single column of text. The block quote isn't quite so pushed in and separate from the rest of the content, and that initial cap is scaled down so it doesn't really kill the overall proportion of things on the screen. All of those things were done with basic plain old vanilla CSS. And the nice thing is the fallback from this, should a browser not support the columns, is it's just going to be in a single column. So these are really safe things to add that don't really have any particular downside, but just by being a little bit more considered, we can really bring a lot more of our design knowledge and our capabilities into the world without introducing a lot of headaches in the workflow process. And that's where the starting points are really important. And I think a lot of people in the room probably do that. You have a starting theme that you always work with, and you put your stuff in it. You put your toolbox there. So I did things like create an OpenType feature SAS mix in. So that's up on GitHub, and you can get that and add that into your project and turn on OpenType features really easily. And then I've got a base theme that I created because I used that a lot, and I decided it would be nicer to put that on D.O. So I took my shortcuts and put it there, and then you can sort of benefit from all of the typographic stuff that I put into that. That theme's called Beep Edition, if you're interested. But there are lots of other good ones out there. But I think that it's coming back to community and looking at that community in the larger sense in this room and in the smaller sense of your own company and your own group of friends and your own meetup group. How can you take what you learn and even just apply that to yourself in a more systematic way? These things don't all have to be done from start to finish on every single project. If you build them into your starting point, then you're just tweaking the values as you go. So this is the last one. This one does require a module, but the awesome thing is there's a module for that. And there's a module for Drupal that's better than what's available for any of the other content management systems, so that's pretty awesome. So Typography is one of my favorites. I know there's at least one other person in the room that uses it pretty regularly. And that enables you to do a bunch of interesting things. Two of the most important ones are replacing hash marks with real quotes. That's pretty nice. It's good to be able to have that happen automatically so you don't have to worry about what people are typing in the content management system edit window. And orphans. Don't leave your orphans behind. An orphan is a single word on the next line of a paragraph just sitting there all on its own. And when you have a layout that scales, you will always get orphans because the width of that paragraph is always changing. And all those little tricks that we apply in print are not going to happen here. But we turn on the typography module, and it does this nifty little thing. It puts a non-breaking space between the last two words. So as I bring this in just a little bit, you can see there's room for that second to last word on the line before, but it's not going to go there because there's a non-breaking space. I have a nice little level of polish that's been added to the design that I know will always be there, and the client doesn't have to think about it. And I got to tell you, in a room full of people from large publishers last week in New York, this, of all the things that I talked about, that got the biggest response. And I can't even take credit for that. I just turned a module on. So, responsive typography. I really believe that when you look at all of these things together, this is not just a subset of responsive design. This is actually something more. This is about design aesthetic, it's about typographical knowledge, and it's about performance and coding, all of those things together. It's about adapting. We need to make sure that we're adapting to everything. This is the web. Let's respect the web. That's the phrase that I want you to take away. Respect your users, respect the web. Get your content on screen. Don't let your ego get in the way. Tune the fallback fonts. Give them the fastest experience, which becomes the best experience. It's about designing for what's next. So here's a neat little thing. We're in an Olympic year. Cast your mind back to the previous Winter Olympics, and you know what was in none of our bags at that time? An iPad. And if you go back to the Winter Olympics before that, you know what also wasn't in your pocket? An iPhone. So in 2 spans of Olympic years for the Winter Olympics, there's been a complete sea change in what we think about as normal in our computing and content consumption experience. You have no idea what's going to come next. But one of the things that I guarantee you will be are things with resolution. And if you don't start thinking about type and relative units and how these things work together, then you are going to be in a very deep hole when the next version of the iPhone comes out or the high-res Retina displays come out on more and more of the desktops and they start reporting true resolution. We are all in a deep hole if we are not considering these things. So let's look forward. Let's make type a central part of what we're doing. Make sure that we're thinking about performance and progression and proportion and polish. And make sure that we're doing that in Drupal. So how do we do that in Drupal? Well, I differ with some people, I think, about this. I think type is completely and intimately tied to the design of your website. I don't think that this is something that should be added on in a module. That's perhaps not the easiest thing to get people to accept, but I think it's important. I think it belongs in the theme. 100%. I think there are some site-building systems where you're trying to build a platform that people are using, and maybe it's appropriate there to have a theme that can select from different typefaces, but that's the exception, not the norm. Most of the time, we're working on one site, one design. It's not something that's meant to change. It's certainly not something you want to put in the hands of your users. Don't waste time putting it in a module. Put it in your theme. Add the layered approach so that you can deal with JavaScript and no JavaScript, making sure things load asynchronously. Those are things that are difficult to do in a module. The Font Your Face module certainly has a lot of my affection. I spent a bunch of time working on the UI for that, and Barris and Scott Rainin did some really amazing work on that. So I really don't want to take anything away from them, but what it doesn't do yet is make use of the web font loader and make use of fallbacks in a way that ensures that the web fonts load even if JavaScript isn't there. Because you can. So this is kind of an example. So this is just cut from that sample page that I was showing you. And what's on the screen right there is all of the JavaScript to asynchronously load web fonts from Google Web Fonts so that it's not going to be a blocker in the page loading process itself. And then in a NoScript tag, it has the CSS. So in case you're in an environment where there's no JavaScript at all, the web fonts will still load. You may lose some of the loading benefits and the smoothness there, but it's still going to get them on the screen and preserve the integrity of your design. So I think that in designing the type, designing the theme, these things are all together. I think they belong in either the template files or however you're going to structure it. But I think it's really important that we acknowledge that those things can't be separated, and you need to do it in this layered way if you're going to provide the best possible experience. Now, I said I was going to come back to typecast and prototyping, and I just want to show you quickly what that looks like. So some of these screenshots were actually made in the Typecast app itself, which is a web-based way to look at web fonts from a wide variety of different vendors and actually build a little typographic prototype that even has responsive breakpoint views. So they've done some pretty interesting things there. It's really worth a play if you want to take a look at that. And you can also export all of the CSS so that whatever you play with in there, you can actually take away and work with in your own site. So it also is shareable. And that's really important too. So as you're developing your designs, you can actually send type prototypes to your client and then test them out on different devices and see how they look. So I'm going to close this with a quote that is a great paraphrasing of that Real Designers Code thing. But Mustafa was a really great guy that I met in London about a month ago. And he had this line in his presentation. And I think you could never imagine a painter not mixing their own paints, not being so intimately familiar with the materials with which they're working. We need to be the same way. As designers, we need to understand what are the implications of what we're trying to do and how best to deliver that experience to the user. And that means we need to understand a little bit of these nuts and bolts that I've been showing you. You don't have to do it every day, but I really think that you need to get a better understanding of exactly how it works and what it's doing in order to provide the best overall experience. And towards that end, I'll come back to this. And this is the last slide, my shameless self-promotion. It is out in an early release right now. I've been working on this for a couple years, and it has tons of examples in it, tons of the sample code that I've been talking about here, most of which you can find if you just look me up on GitHub anyway, but buy the book. It's not that expensive. So at this point, I'm going to go here and say thank you, and we've got some time for questions. Slides are already up. You can grab them. If you are so inclined, we would certainly appreciate it if you would rate the session. So, questions? Thank you. You know the drill now. The mic in the middle. Everybody line up. Go ahead.
Mic in the middle. It's going to take a little change in thinking to start thinking about media queries in ems instead of pixels. Can you tell us what cut points you normally use, one or multiple, and what those sizes would be?
It's actually a lot simpler than you think. And it's math you only probably have to do once. It's if your type is set to sort of that 100%, 1em is basically 16 pixels. So just do the math that way. And instead of doing a breakpoint at, let's say you're choosing 400 pixels, divide that by 16, and there's your number. So I usually start with like 25 ems, 40-something, about 58 or 60, and then maybe one slightly bigger than that. But you only have to do that math once. It's not actually that big a deal. But it does have huge rendering implications, so it's really worth it.
Thank you.
Sure.
We recently had a client who needed drop caps, and so I did a lot of reading about the different methods, like the first pseudo class and using spans. Do you have a preferred method or any thoughts about that?
I think it's not sustainable to rely upon classes, and I think it works well enough in a large enough percentage of browsers that using the first of type first child, it's actually a chain of 2 pseudo classes that will get you the first letter of the first paragraph.
Right.
So that way you can sort of scope it to that div or that container for the content itself, and then you basically look like P : first of type : first child, or this might be the other way around.
Yeah, gotcha.
But that will give you the effect that you're looking for in a pretty reliable, non-destructive way. And the fallback is simply that it stays the same size. So unless they're really concerned about every single possible older browser, that's probably the safest way to go.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
And another quick question. What was the CSS class or property that you used for the 2 columns, the text that flows into 2 columns?
That was actually just CSS columns. I mean, it's really like nothing fancy about it. Just look it up on CSS Tricks. That's where I cribbed the code from. I haven't done it enough to be able to tell you off the top of my head, but it was pretty easy to find.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Sure.
Thanks for your talk. That was very compelling.
Oh, thank you.
So I'm a developer. I used to be a designer, and one area that's been very challenging for me in web typography is that the design world really hasn't kept pace with the development world in regards to open licensing. And to be honest, I don't really seem interested in having that conversation. It's very interested in proprietary, like copyright, all rights reserved, which for me, working in a GPL world makes it basically impossible to ever package a distribution with the fonts included. All I can really do is like call out to Google Web Fonts, but who knows if they'll have internet access when they're loading it up. So what do you do about that?
Well, making fonts is hard. So that's something that I used to harp on a lot. Don't use Font Squirrel. You're almost always going to be breaking the law in doing that. I guarantee it, if you're getting anything that's other than an open source typeface. But there are more and more good open source typefaces out there. Open Sans, Clear Sans, Source Sans. Now Fira Sans has come out, and that one you can get from the Mozilla website. Those are all ones that have some form of open source licensing. So there are more options. Most of the services are now getting more and more affordable as well. They're starting to realize that licensing terms do have to change. The services themselves are pretty cheap, and I really recommend them because they update the fonts for you. But it does remain a challenge. It does limit the palette that you have to work with. I agree. I don't have a better explanation, though, unfortunately, other than it's a huge amount of time that they spend to make the fonts work well. So it's not likely that they're going to end up giving a ton of them away.
Thank you.
Sure.
As an old school typographer, am I booming loud enough? As an old school typographer, I loved this session. This was awesome. You were singing to me.
You are my target audience.
And unfortunately, I have a very boring, pragmatic question. So my communication manager that I work with, she does not care for, or I rephrase, she wants lorem ipsum because it's obvious it's not real content. I'm sure you've had that pushback before.
Sure, but if you put a couple paragraphs of Moby Dick in there, they're not going to think that's real content either.
I love Filarati. I've used it, and I got in trouble for it.
What I would say is push back and say then deliver real content. Because lorem ipsum has a rigid repeating set of breaks that are never going to flow the same as real copy does. And so that's the pushback, is if you don't want us to use it, then deliver the content that should have been here in the first place, and we'll work with that. I mean, it's a tough argument. I get that, but
I forgot to add she's my boss. So
tough love. Right, and so it's dummy text versus Greek text, and the problem is what ends up happening, it's the same thing as picking a photo and putting it in the design. You always pick the wrong one, and that becomes what the conversation is about. I do understand that, but I think it's important about the integrity of the design. So it's just finding some passage that's acceptable and push back and find that. Go ahead.
We have a multinational, multilingual, localized site, and so dealing with Cyrillic and Japanese and Korean and all that. Do you have any recommendations or tips that you've dealt with running into that?
Yeah, actually, I try not to pimp any one given service, but fonts.com does do dynamic subsetting, especially in their non-Western stuff. They're starting to do it in more kinds of character sets, but if you want to use a service, they've probably got the best solution for using web fonts in multiple language environments, and will give you the best performance by adding that subsetting. I guess that's it. Thanks, everyone. Let's all go get a beer.